The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Kensington Palace, as Thomas Crawford adjusted his ceremonial bearskin hat for what he thought would be just another routine day. At 52 years old, Thomas had served in the Queen's Guard for nearly 3 decades, standing motionless for hours in scorching heat and bitter cold, his face an unmoving mask of discipline and duty. Thomas came from a long line of military men. His grandfather had served in World War II, his father in the Falklands, and he had proudly continued the tradition. The uniform meant everything to him. It represented honor, sacrifice, and an unbroken chain of service that stretched back generations. His children had grown up seeing their father in that iconic red tunic and tall black hat, standing guard at some of Britain's most important locations. But lately, something had changed inside Thomas. The pride he once felt had begun to crack like old paint on weathered wood. It started small at first, just whispers among the guards during brief moments when they could speak. Budget cuts were coming. The Ministry of Defense was restructuring. Rumors swirled that ceremonial duties might be reduced or even outsourced to private security firms to save money. Thomas tried to ignore the gossip, but then the official memos started arriving. Pension adjustments, reduced benefits for long-serving guards, changes to the rotation schedule that meant more hours with less compensation. He felt the weight of these changes pressing down on him like his heavy bearskin hat on a summer day. His wife, Margaret, had noticed the shift in him. Over breakfast that morning, she had squeezed his hand and said, "You seem troubled, love. Is everything all right at work?" Thomas had simply nodded and kissed her forehead, unwilling to burden her with his growing doubts about a career he had dedicated his entire adult life to. As he took his position outside the palace gates that morning, Thomas felt something he had never experienced before during duty, a profound sense of questioning. Was this really worth it anymore? The tourists still snapped their photos, some trying to make him laugh or break his stoic expression. He remained perfectly still as he had been trained to do, but inside his mind was racing. The palace grounds were unusually quiet that Wednesday morning. Most of the royal family was away on official business, or so Thomas had heard through the internal communications. He stood at his post near the garden entrance, a position he had held hundreds of times before. The familiar weight of his rifle rested against his shoulder. His polished boots gleamed in the sunlight. Everything appeared normal on the outside, but Thomas had made a decision during his sleepless night. After 30 years of dedicated service, after missing countless family dinners and school plays and birthdays because duty called, after standing in the rain and snow and blistering heat without complaint, he had decided this would be his last week. He would submit his resignation on Friday. The thought both terrified and liberated him. He had not told anyone yet, not even Margaret. The decision felt too new, too raw. Part of him wondered if he was being foolish, throwing away his pension and security over what might just be a difficult phase. But another part of him, the part that had been growing louder in recent months, knew that something fundamental had broken in his relationship with the service he had once loved so dearly. The morning stretched on in its usual rhythm. A groundskeeper passed by with a polite nod. A palace administrator hurried past with an armful of folders. A delivery truck rumbled through the service entrance. Thomas remained motionless, his eyes fixed straight ahead, his breathing slow and measured. To any observer, he was the picture of perfect military bearing, but inside, Thomas was saying goodbye. He was memorizing the feel of the morning breeze, the sound of the gravel crunching under passing feet, the distant chime of church bells marking the hour. These were the small details he had lived with for so long that they had become invisible. And now he was noticing them all over again with the sharp clarity that comes when you know something is ending. Around mid-morning, Thomas heard a sound that was unusual for this quiet Wednesday. Young voices bright with excitement echoed from somewhere deeper in the palace gardens. He could not turn his head to look. His discipline held firm, but his ears tracked the sound. Children were playing somewhere nearby, their laughter carrying on the wind like music. The voices grew closer, and Thomas recognized the careful tones of a nanny or guardian, gently guiding the children while allowing them freedom to explore. He had heard similar sounds before when royal children had been in residence. Though usually they were kept well away from the guard post to avoid disruption to the serious business of security. Thomas kept his eyes forward, but he could sense movement in his peripheral vision, Small figures were approaching along the garden path that ran parallel to his post. His training kept him perfectly still, but his attention was fully engaged now. There was something about the innocence of children that always touched him, perhaps because his own grandchildren were around that age now. The footsteps came closer and then stopped. Thomas could feel someone standing just to his left, well within his peripheral vision but not directly in front of him. A small voice, young and curious, spoke to someone else. The accent was unmistakably refined, the kind of precise enunciation that came from careful tutoring. Thomas remained motionless, his face expressionless, but his heart rate had picked up slightly. In all his years of service, he had stood guard while countless people passed by, but there was something about this moment that felt different. He could not explain why, but his instincts told him that something significant was about to happen. The small figure in his peripheral vision moved slightly closer. Thomas could see it was a young boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, dressed in neat casual clothes that spoke of quality without ostentation. The child was looking up at him with open curiosity, the way children do before the world teaches them to hide their wonder. Then, without warning or fanfare, Thomas felt his careful composure crack just slightly, because in that moment, looking at this curious child who represented everything he had spent his career protecting, Thomas felt the full weight of his decision to leave. And something unexpected happened, something that would change the course of his final days in service. Thomas maintained his rigid stance, but every sense was heightened as the young boy stood nearby, studying him with innocent fascination. The child's nanny stood a respectful distance back, her posture relaxed but attentive. She seemed content to let the boy observe the guard, perhaps understanding that these moments of curiosity were valuable learning experiences. The boy took another small step closer, now standing almost directly beside Thomas's post. In his peripheral vision, Thomas could see the child's face more clearly now. There was something remarkably composed about the boy despite his young age, a certain gravity that sat alongside his natural childhood curiosity. His eyes traveled up and down Thomas's uniform, taking in every detail of the red tunic, the gleaming buttons, the ceremonial sword, the imposing bearskin hat. For several long minutes, the boy simply stood there in silence, watching. Thomas had experienced this countless times before. Tourists often tried to provoke reactions, making faces or telling jokes, testing to see if they could break the famous stoicism of the Queen's Guard. Children especially seemed to view it as a challenge, a game to make the soldier smile or blink or acknowledge their presence. But this child was different. He did not try to make Thomas laugh. He did not wave his hands or pull funny faces. He simply stood and observed with a quietness that seemed unusual for someone so young. There was respect in his silence, an intuitive understanding that this was not a game or a performance, but someone performing an important duty. Thomas felt an unexpected emotion rising in his chest. Here he was, planning to abandon his post, to walk away from decades of service because he felt undervalued and overlooked by bureaucrats who saw guards as line items in a budget, rather than human beings with families and needs. Yet this child, who could not have been more than 9 years old, seemed to understand something that the administrators had forgotten. He saw the person inside the uniform. The morning sun climbed higher, and still the boy stood there. The nanny checked her watch discreetly but made no move to hurry her young charge along. Thomas's legs ached slightly from standing so still for so long, a familiar sensation that he usually ignored through sheer discipline. But today he felt it more acutely, perhaps because he was counting down his final days in this position. Then something remarkable happened. The boy, who had been standing slightly to the side, moved to stand directly in front of Thomas, though still at a respectful distance. He was not trying to disrupt or challenge. Instead, he stood at attention himself, his small back straight, his hands at his sides, his chin lifted slightly. He was mirroring Thomas's posture. Thomas felt his throat tighten unexpectedly. Through his decades of service, he had been photographed millions of times, had been the subject of countless tourist selfies, had been pointed at and discussed in dozens of languages. But never had anyone stood with him like this, acknowledging not just the spectacle but the discipline, the commitment, the sacrifice that the uniform represented. The boy held the position for perhaps 2 minutes, which is a very long time for a young child to stand perfectly still. His arms remained at his sides. His expression grew serious, concentrated. He was not mocking or playing. He was honoring what he saw before him. Thomas felt something shift inside him. The bitterness and disappointment that had been building for months seemed to crack open slightly, letting in a ray of something else. Not quite hope, but perhaps perspective. He had been so focused on the pension adjustments and the budget memos that he had forgotten what the uniform actually meant beyond the bureaucratic machinery. The nanny finally stepped forward gently, placing a light hand on the boy's shoulder. She spoke softly. Words Thomas could not quite hear, but her tone was kind and understanding. The boy nodded and relaxed his posture slightly, though he kept his eyes on Thomas's face, searching perhaps for some flicker of acknowledgement. Thomas gave none, of course. His training held firm. His expression remained neutral, his gaze fixed forward, his body absolutely still. But inside, his mind was racing with thoughts and emotions he had not expected to feel during what he had planned as one of his final shifts. The boy seemed to understand that no response would come, yet he did not appear disappointed. Instead, his expression softened into something that looked almost like gratitude. He took one step back, then another, his eyes never leaving Thomas's face until the nanny gently turned him toward the garden path. Before they walked away, something extraordinary occurred. The boy, with a formality that seemed beyond his years, brought his small hand up in a proper military salute. It was not a childish approximation or a playful gesture. His hand was positioned correctly, his wrist straight, his fingers together and extended. Someone had taught him how to salute properly, and he executed it with genuine respect. Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. Every fiber of his being wanted to return the salute, to acknowledge this gesture of pure, uncomplicated respect from someone who saw him as more than just a tourist attraction or a budget line item. His hand twitched almost imperceptibly at his side, a movement so small that no one watching would have noticed. But Thomas held his discipline. He could not break protocol even for this. The rules were clear, and he had followed them faithfully for 30 years. Yet something about this moment would stay with him in a way that thousands of other shifts had not. The boy lowered his hand slowly, his salute complete. For just a moment, his young face showed a flicker of something, perhaps disappointment that his gesture had not been returned, or perhaps understanding that it could not be. Then he smiled. Just a small, gentle smile that seemed to say he understood anyway. The nanny guided him away down the garden path, and Thomas watched them go from the corner of his eye until they disappeared around a hedge of perfectly manicured roses. The courtyard returned to its usual quiet, the moment passing into memory like countless others. But Thomas knew this one was different. Something about that wordless exchange had pierced through his armor of resentment and fatigue. A child he had never met, whose name he did not know, had reminded him of something essential that he had lost sight of amid the budget cuts and policy changes. The uniform meant something. Not because of what administrators wrote in memos, but because of what it represented to people: duty, honor, tradition, steadfastness. Those things had value that could not be calculated in pension adjustments or measured in budget allocations. Thomas stood his post for the remainder of his shift, but his mind was no longer focused on his resignation letter. Instead, he found himself thinking about that small, serious face, that perfectly executed salute, that moment of pure connection across the vast distance between a career soldier and a young child. The rest of Thomas's shift passed in a blur of contemplation. When his replacement arrived at the designated hour, Thomas executed his relief ceremony with the same precision he always had. But his mind was elsewhere. He marched back to the guardhouse, removed his ceremonial uniform with careful attention, and changed into his regular clothes. The other guards chatted around him about football scores and weekend plans, but Thomas remained mostly silent, lost in thought. During his drive home through London's congested streets, Thomas replayed the morning's encounter over and over in his mind. He tried to recall every detail of the boy's face, the exact angle of that salute, the quality of silence that had existed between them. There had been no words, yet somehow everything that needed to be communicated had passed between them. Margaret was in the kitchen when Thomas arrived home, preparing dinner as she did most evenings. She looked up from chopping vegetables and immediately noticed something different in her husband's expression. After 31 years of marriage, she could read his moods like others read books. "Something happened today," she said, setting down her knife. It was a statement, not a question. Thomas nodded slowly and sat down at the kitchen table, suddenly feeling the weight of his 52 years in his bones. He told her everything, from his planned resignation to the encounter with the young boy, trying to put into words the strange significance of those few minutes in the palace courtyard. Margaret listened without interruption, her hands still, her full attention on her husband's face. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "Maybe that little boy reminded you why you started this job in the first place," she said gently. Before all the paperwork and politics got in the way, Thomas knew she was right, but the realization brought its own complications. He had spent weeks mentally preparing to leave, convincing himself that walking away was the right choice. Now, one wordless encounter with a child had shaken that conviction to its foundation. He felt confused and somewhat foolish for allowing such a small moment to affect him so deeply. That night, Thomas barely slept. He lay awake staring at the ceiling, listening to Margaret's gentle breathing beside him. His mind kept returning to that salute, to the seriousness in the boy's young face, to the respect that had been offered freely without any expectation of return. It had been such a simple gesture, yet it carried more weight than 1,000 administrative memos. By morning, Thomas had made a decision. He would not submit his resignation on Friday as planned. Instead, he would give himself more time to think, to understand what he truly wanted. One encounter with a respectful child should not be enough to overturn months of careful consideration. Yet he owed it to himself to examine why it had affected him so profoundly. The next few days passed normally enough. Thomas stood his shifts, maintained his discipline, and kept his thoughts to himself. But he found himself watching for the boy again, hoping perhaps for another encounter that might provide clarity. The young visitor did not return, and Thomas felt an unexpected disappointment at his absence. On Friday evening, instead of submitting his resignation, Thomas attended the weekly briefing for senior guards. The officer in charge discussed scheduling changes and security protocols, the usual mix of practical information and bureaucratic requirements. But toward the end of the meeting, something unexpected happened. The commanding officer cleared his throat and said, "I have been asked to pass along some information that came through official channels this week. It appears that young Prince George spent time observing one of our guards on Wednesday morning during a private walk in the palace gardens. His protection officer reported that the experience made quite an impression on the young prince." Thomas felt his heart skip. Prince George. The boy had been Prince George. He had stood beside the third in line to the British throne, had received a salute from a future king, and had not even known it. The realization hit him like a physical blow. The commanding officer continued, seeming unaware of Thomas's internal reaction. The report noted that Prince George demonstrated exceptional respect and understanding of military protocol. His tutor, apparently, spent the following day answering questions about the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. It seems the young prince has developed quite an interest in military service, and several of the guards murmured appreciatively, pleased that their work had inspired such interest from a young royal. But Thomas sat frozen, pieces clicking into place in his mind. That explained the perfectly executed salute, the natural dignity, the nanny who was likely a protection officer, the quality of silence that had seemed so unusual for a child. But it also meant something more. Prince George, who would one day be king, who was being groomed from birth for extraordinary responsibility, had taken time from his morning to stand and honor an ordinary guard. Not because anyone required it, not because cameras were watching, but simply because he had recognized something worthy of respect. Thomas felt his eyes grow damp, and he blinked rapidly to clear them. Around him, the briefing continued with other mundane matters, but he heard none of it. His mind was miles away, standing again in that courtyard, receiving that salute from a boy who carried the weight of future kingship on his small shoulders, yet still made time to acknowledge the person inside the ceremonial uniform. After the briefing ended, Thomas waited until the room had cleared before approaching his commanding officer. The older man looked up from his papers with a questioning expression. "Crawford, something I can help you with?" Thomas hesitated, then said, "Sir, the guard that Prince George observed on Wednesday." "That was me, sir. I was posted at the garden entrance. The commanding officer's expression shifted to something warmer. Were you now? Well, Crawford, you obviously made quite the impression. The report was very positive. Noted your exemplary bearing and discipline. He paused, studying Thomas's face. Is everything all right? You look troubled. Thomas struggled to find the right words. How could he explain that he had been planning to resign? That a 9-year-old boy's gesture had shaken his resolve? That he was questioning everything he thought he knew about his career and its meaning? Finally, he simply said, "No, sir, everything's fine. I just wanted to confirm that was the situation." "Thank you, sir." He left before the officer could ask more questions. Outside the building, Thomas stood in the cool evening air and tried to steady his breathing. Margaret had been right. The encounter had reminded him why he had chosen this path 30 years ago. It was not about the pension or the benefits or the administrative recognition. It was about service, about being part of something larger than himself, about standing as a symbol of continuity and tradition in a rapidly changing world. Over the weekend, Thomas found himself doing something he had not done in years. He went up to the attic and pulled out old photo albums and boxes of memorabilia from his 3 decades of service. Margaret brought him tea and sat beside him on the dusty floor, looking through the photographs together. There were pictures from his early days, fresh-faced and proud in his new uniform, standing ramrod straight with the exaggerated intensity of youth. Photos from ceremonial occasions, from his posting at Buckingham Palace, from the time he had stood guard during a state visit. Pictures of medal ceremonies, of retirement parties for fellow guards, of moments both grand and mundane that had made up his career. "Look at this one," Margaret said softly, holding up a photograph from 25 years earlier. In it, Thomas stood at attention while a small girl, perhaps 3 years old, looked up at him with wonder. "You've inspired so many people over the years, Thomas. Not just that little prince. All these children who have seen you and learned what dedication looks like." Thomas studied the photograph, seeing his younger self through older eyes. That version of Thomas had been so certain, so untroubled by doubt. When had that certainty crumbled? When had the bureaucracy and budget cuts begun to overshadow the meaning behind the service? He realized it had been a gradual erosion, like water wearing away stone. Each small disappointment, each policy change that seemed to devalue the Guard's contribution, each moment of feeling invisible or taken for granted had added up over the years. The financial concerns were real, certainly, but they had also become a convenient focus for deeper feelings of being unappreciated and overlooked. "I've been a fool," Thomas said quietly. "I let myself forget what this was really about. I let spreadsheets and pension calculations make me lose sight of why any of this matters." Margaret squeezed his hand. "You're not a fool. You're human. You've given 30 years of your life to this service, and you wanted that sacrifice to be acknowledged. There's nothing wrong with that. But maybe that little prince reminded you that the acknowledgement doesn't always come from the people writing the checks." Thomas thought about that conversation through the rest of the weekend. He thought about it during his Sunday dinner with his adult children and grandchildren, watching his own grandson play with toy soldiers, lining them up with serious concentration. He thought about it while walking the dog through the neighborhood park, passing by groups of children playing. On Monday morning, Thomas returned to duty with a different mindset. The budget cuts and administrative changes had not disappeared. His pension would still be less than he had hoped for. The rotating schedules would still mean long hours for less compensation. None of the practical concerns had changed, but something in Thomas had shifted. He stood his post with renewed attention, not just going through the motions, but truly inhabiting the role again. When tourists took photos, he saw them differently now, not as intrusions, but as people connecting with tradition and history through his presence. When children watched him with wide eyes, he remembered that he was showing them something important about discipline and duty. The week passed quickly, and before Thomas knew it, Friday had arrived. The day he had originally planned to submit his resignation letter. Instead, he found himself standing at attention in the palace courtyard, the morning sun warming his red tunic, his mind clear and focused for the first time in months. Around mid-morning, Thomas heard familiar voices approaching from the garden path. His heart rate increased slightly, though his expression remained perfectly neutral. He recognized the tone before he could make out the words. Young, refined, curious, and this time, there was more than one child's voice mixing with the sounds of adult conversation. Through his peripheral vision, Thomas saw a small group approaching. Prince George was there, and with him was a younger girl who could only be Princess Charlotte. They were accompanied by what appeared to be a tutor and 2 protection officers, walking at a leisurely pace through the gardens. The children stopped when they came parallel to Thomas's post. Prince George said something to his sister, gesturing toward Thomas. The little girl looked up with bright interest, clearly receiving some kind of explanation from her older brother. Thomas could not hear the words, but he could guess at their content. Prince George stepped closer to Thomas's position, but not as close as he had come during their previous encounter. He seemed to be demonstrating something to his sister, perhaps showing her the proper way to observe a guard on duty. The boy's bearing had the same quiet respect Thomas remembered, but there was something additional now. A hint of pride, perhaps, in sharing something he considered important with his younger sibling. Princess Charlotte watched her brother carefully, then looked up at Thomas with the uncomplicated directness of a young child. She whispered something to Prince George, who smiled and shook his head gently as if explaining that no, the guard would not talk or move or acknowledge them, and that was exactly how it should be. Thomas felt a swell of emotion that he carefully contained behind his practiced neutral expression. Here were 2 children who would grow up with extraordinary privilege and responsibility, being taught not just about protocol and procedure, but about respect for others, about recognizing service, about understanding that the person inside the uniform mattered. What happened next surprised Thomas even more than Prince George's salute had done. The young prince reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. He looked at it for a moment, then placed it carefully on the ground near Thomas's post, securing it with a small stone so it would not blow away. Prince George straightened up, made brief eye contact with Thomas's forward-facing gaze, and nodded once. It was a small gesture, barely perceptible but loaded with meaning. Then he gently took his sister's hand and guided her away down the garden path, followed by their attendants. Thomas remained perfectly still, but his mind was racing. What was on that paper? Had Prince George left him a message? The thought seemed almost impossible, yet there it was, folded neatly and weighted down just a few feet from his post. It took every ounce of his discipline not to break protocol and reach for it immediately. The minutes crawled by with agonizing slowness. Thomas kept his eyes forward, his body motionless, but his awareness was entirely focused on that folded paper. Was it against protocol? Should he report it? Would his commanding officer be angry that he had somehow allowed this breach of procedure? But deeper than those practical concerns was a profound curiosity about what message a 9-year-old prince felt compelled to leave for an ordinary guard. The paper seemed to glow in Thomas's peripheral vision, drawing his attention like a beacon despite his rigid discipline. Finally, after what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, Thomas's shift ended. His replacement arrived, they executed the formal changeover, and Thomas marched away from his post with measured steps. Only when he was out of sight of the public areas did he allow himself to quicken his pace back toward the guardhouse. Thomas had to force himself to follow proper procedure. He changed out of his ceremonial uniform with deliberate care, hanging each piece exactly where it belonged, polishing his boots for the next shift even though his hands trembled slightly with anticipation. The other guards in the changing room chatted about their evening plans, but Thomas barely heard them. Only when he was fully changed into civilian clothes did Thomas allow himself to walk quickly, almost running back toward the courtyard. His heart hammered in his chest as he worried that the paper might be gone, blown away by wind or removed by a conscientious groundskeeper who did not understand its significance. But when he reached the spot where he had stood guard, the paper was still there, the small stone holding it securely in place. Thomas looked around to ensure he was unobserved, then bent down and picked it up with hands that shook more than he would have liked to admit. The paper was good quality, slightly heavy, the kind of stationery that suggested importance. Thomas unfolded it carefully, almost reverently. Inside, in careful, practiced handwriting that showed the efforts of a child working hard to write neatly, were just a few lines. Dear Guard, thank you for standing so still and being so brave. My teacher says you protect us and our history. I think you are doing something very important. I hope you know that people notice and care. With respect and gratitude, George. Thomas read the words 3 times, his vision blurring slightly as unexpected tears gathered in his eyes. It was such a simple message, written in the straightforward language of a child. Yet it carried more weight than any official commendation or administrative memo ever had. Someone had noticed. Someone had cared. And not just anyone, but a young boy who was being groomed to lead a nation, who had enough on his small shoulders already, yet still took time to acknowledge an ordinary guard. Thomas folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his jacket pocket, his hand resting over it protectively. He stood there in the courtyard for several minutes, looking at the spot where he had received that salute, where he had stood countless times before, where he would stand countless times again. The space looked different now, imbued with new meaning. That evening, Thomas showed the letter to Margaret. She read it slowly, her own eyes growing misty as she took in the careful words. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered. "What a precious thing. This child will be king someday, and he took the time to write this to you." "That's exactly what makes it so meaningful," Thomas replied. "He did not have to. No one would have expected it. But something about our encounter mattered enough to him that he wanted me to know he understood. He saw me, Margaret. Not just the uniform, but the person inside it." Margaret folded the letter and handed it back to her husband. "So what will you do now? Are you still thinking about leaving?" Thomas shook his head slowly. "No, I think I was looking at everything the wrong way. I was so focused on what I was not getting from the job, the recognition from administrators, the financial security, the appreciation from people who make policy. But that was never really what this was about. This letter reminded me that the real reward comes from moments like these, from inspiring children, from being part of something that connects past and future, from standing as a symbol of something steady in a world that changes too fast." Over the weekend, Thomas took the letter to a small frame shop in town. He had it professionally mounted behind glass with simple but elegant framing that honored the message without overwhelming it. When he got home, he hung it in his study, where he could see it when he sat at his desk in the evenings. His adult daughter came by for Sunday lunch and noticed the new addition to his study wall. She read the letter carefully, then looked at her father with an expression he could not quite read. "Dad, this is incredible. Do you know how special this is?" Thomas nodded. "I do now, though it took me a while to understand." His daughter sat down beside him. "You know, I never really understood what you did. I mean, I knew you were a guard, but when I was young, I thought you just stood around all day. It seemed boring. But reading this, seeing how it affected this little boy, I'm starting to understand. You represent something important. You're a living connection to history and tradition. You show people what commitment and discipline look like." Her words, combined with Prince George's letter, created a sense of completion in Thomas's mind. He had spent so much of his career feeling invisible, unappreciated by the people who signed his checks and wrote his schedules. But he had been looking for validation in the wrong places. The real measure of his service was not in pension statements or administrative memos, but in moments like the one that young Prince had gifted him. On Monday morning, Thomas returned to duty with a lightness he had not felt in years. When he took his position in the courtyard, he stood not with resentment or resignation, but with renewed purpose. Each tourist photo, each curious child, each moment of stillness became meaningful again. He was not just performing a job. He was embodying an ideal. The week brought its usual mix of routine duties and small challenges. Budget discussions continued in administrative offices. Schedule adjustments were announced. The practical realities of the job had not changed. But Thomas's relationship to those realities had transformed completely. He could acknowledge the frustrations without letting them define his experience. On Thursday afternoon, something extraordinary happened. Thomas was called to the commanding officer's quarters. An unusual summons that made him wonder if he had somehow violated protocol by accepting Prince George's note. He walked to the office with measured steps, his expression neutral even as his mind raced with possibilities. The commanding officer looked up when Thomas entered and gestured to a chair. "Sit down, Crawford. I have some news that I think you will find interesting." Thomas sat, his back straight, his hands resting lightly on his knees. Whatever was coming, he would face it with the same discipline he brought to his guard duties. The officer picked up a folder from his desk and opened it. "I received a communication from the royal household this morning. It seems that Prince George's recent interest in the Queen's Guard, sparked by his observation of you last week, has led to several educational discussions with his tutors about military service and tradition. The young prince apparently wrote a school essay about the importance of ceremonial guards, and it made quite an impression on his instructors. Thomas felt his chest tighten with emotion but kept his expression neutral. The officer continued. The communication goes on to note that Prince George specifically requested that his appreciation for your exemplary service be formally acknowledged. While we cannot have direct contact between royal family members and individual guards outside of official duties, the household wanted us to know that your dedication to duty has had a meaningful educational impact on the young prince. The commanding officer closed the folder and looked directly at Thomas. Crawford, in my 28 years of service, I have never received such a communication. You should be very proud. Whatever you did during that encounter, it clearly embodied everything we hope the Queen's Guard represents. Thomas swallowed hard, fighting to maintain his composure. Thank you, sir. I simply stood my post as I have been trained to do. Perhaps, the officer said with a slight smile. But there's standing a post, and then there's truly embodying what that post means. You achieved the latter, and it was noticed by someone who will someday be our king. That's no small thing. Thomas walked out of the commanding officer's quarters feeling as though he was floating. The formal acknowledgement from the royal household felt surreal, almost impossible to process. He had gone from planning his resignation just 2 weeks earlier to receiving recognition for inspiring a future king. The transformation felt too dramatic to be real, yet it had happened through nothing more than doing his job with integrity and being witnessed by the right person at the right moment. That evening, Thomas gathered his family for dinner at his home. His 2 adult children came with their spouses and his 3 grandchildren, filling the house with warmth and noise. Over roast beef and potatoes, Thomas told them the full story. From his planned resignation to the encounter with Prince George, to the formal acknowledgement he had received that day. His son, Michael, who had always been somewhat dismissive of his father's career, sat quietly for a long moment after the story ended. Then he said, Dad, I need to apologize. I never really understood what you did. I thought it was just ceremonial, not really important in the modern world. But hearing this, seeing how much it meant to that kid, to the future king no less, I get it now. You're not just standing around. You're holding space for something that matters. Thomas felt his throat tighten. His son's approval meant more than he had realized. For years he had sensed Michael's quiet disappointment that his father had not pursued a more lucrative or prestigious career. Hearing this acknowledgement felt like another piece of healing falling into place. His granddaughter, Emma, who was 7 years old, piped up with a child's directness. Grandpa, can I come see you at work? I want to see you in your big hat, Thomas smiled. Maybe someday, sweetheart, but I have to stay very still when I'm working, so I won't be able to talk to you or wave. Would that be all right? Emma nodded seriously. That's okay. I'll be good and quiet like the prince was, and I'll know it's you inside the uniform even if you can't move. The simplicity of her understanding touched Thomas deeply. Children seemed to grasp intuitively what many adults had forgotten, that the person and the role were not separate things but woven together, each giving meaning to the other. In the weeks that followed, Thomas noticed changes rippling through the guard company. Word had spread about the prince's interest and the formal acknowledgement, and it seemed to have sparked something in the other guards. There was a renewed sense of pride in their bearing, a heightened attention to detail, a reminder that what they did mattered beyond the bureaucratic machinery that employed them. The commanding officer began their next monthly briefing by saying, Gentlemen, recent events have reminded us all why we stand these posts. We are not museum pieces or tourist attractions, though we serve those functions. We are living embodiments of duty, discipline, and service. Every child who watches us, every visitor who photographs us, every citizen who sees us is connecting with something larger than themselves. Never forget that you represent centuries of tradition and sacrifice. Thomas felt the words resonate through the room. He was not the only guard who had been struggling with doubts and frustrations. The budget cuts and administrative changes had affected everyone. But Prince George's gesture had provided something the administration could not, a reminder of meaning beyond material compensation. Thomas continued his duties through the changing seasons, standing his posts in rain and shine, heat and cold, with the same steady presence he had maintained for 30 years. But now each shift felt different. He was not counting down days until retirement or nursing resentment about pension adjustments. Instead, he found himself fully present in each moment, aware that he might be observed by someone, child or adult, who needed to see what steadfast commitment looked like. One afternoon in late autumn, Thomas was standing post near the palace gates when a school group approached with their teacher. The children, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, gathered at a respectful distance while their teacher explained the history and significance of the Queen's Guard. Thomas could hear fragments of the lesson drifting toward him. These guards represent something very important, the teacher was saying. They show us that some things remain constant even when the world around us changes quickly. They demonstrate discipline and duty, and inside each uniform is a person who has chosen to serve something larger than themselves. One small boy raised his hand. "Miss, do they ever get tired of standing so still?" The teacher smiled. "I imagine they do sometimes, but part of their service is pushing through that discomfort to do their duty. That's what makes it meaningful. Anyone can stand still when it's easy. These guards do it even when it's hard." Thomas felt a surge of gratitude for this teacher who understood and was passing that understanding to the next generation. This was what Prince George's gesture had reminded him of, that his service had value in ways that transcended administrative recognition or financial compensation. After the school group moved on, Thomas remained at his post for another 2 hours until his shift ended. When he finally marched away, his legs aching and his shoulders stiff, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. He had done his job well, as he had done it thousands of times before, as he would do it hundreds of times more before his eventual retirement. The following week, Thomas received an unexpected letter in the mail at his home. The return address showed it was from a primary school in Manchester. Curious, he opened it carefully. Inside was a collection of drawings from a class of 7-year-olds who had visited London and seen the guards at Buckingham Palace. The teacher's accompanying note explained that the students had been so inspired by the guards that they had each drawn a picture and written a short note. "Your service made a real impression on these children," the teacher wrote. "They've been talking about duty and discipline ever since our trip. You helped me teach them something important about commitment and service." Thomas spread the drawings across his kitchen table. Stick figures in red tunics and tall black hats stood at attention in front of crudely drawn palaces. The notes were written in shaky handwriting, with creative spelling and boundless enthusiasm. "Thank you for protecting the Queen. You are very brave. I want to be like you when I grow up. You stood so still. How do you do that?" Margaret came to look over his shoulder, reading the notes with him. "See," she said softly. "You're making a difference, Thomas. Not just to one prince, but to all these children, to everyone who sees you and remembers that dedication and duty still matter in this world." Thomas carefully placed the drawings in a folder, adding them to the small collection of meaningful items from his career. Prince George's letter held pride of place, framed on his study wall, but these drawings from ordinary children felt equally precious. They were evidence that his service rippled outward in ways he could not always see or measure. 3 years passed from that transformative encounter with Prince George, and Thomas remained with the Queen's Guard. The budget cuts that had once felt so devastating were implemented, but they no longer defined his experience of service. He had learned to hold his sense of purpose separate from administrative decisions, to find meaning in the work itself rather than in external validation. Thomas was now approaching his 55th birthday and beginning to seriously consider retirement, not from disillusionment this time, but from a natural sense of completion. His body was showing the wear of decades of standing at attention in all weather conditions. His knees ached on cold mornings. His back protested after long shifts. It was time to begin thinking about the next chapter of his life. But he approached this consideration differently than he had 3 years earlier. Instead of feeling pushed out by bureaucracy and frustration, he felt ready to step back naturally, having given all he could give to the service. There was peace in that distinction, a sense of choosing rather than being forced. On a bright spring morning, Thomas stood at his usual post near the palace gardens, the same spot where he had first encountered Prince George. The trees were bursting with new growth, their branches heavy with pink and white blossoms. Birds sang in the warming air. It was the kind of day that made Thomas grateful to have an outdoor job, despite its physical demands. Around mid-morning, Thomas heard familiar sounds approaching. Voices, multiple children this time along with adults in conversation. His heart rate picked up slightly, though his expression remained perfectly neutral. Through his peripheral vision, he saw a small group emerging from the garden path. Prince George was there, noticeably taller and older now at 12, his features showing the transition from child to young man. Beside him walked Princess Charlotte, now about 10, and the younger Prince Louis, perhaps 6 years old. They were accompanied by what appeared to be tutors and protection officers, moving through the gardens as part of what looked like an outdoor education session. The group stopped near Thomas's post, and he heard one of the tutors explaining something about the palace's history and security arrangements. Prince George stood slightly apart from the group, his attention focused on Thomas. The young prince's face showed recognition, though he maintained the same quiet respect he had demonstrated during their first encounter. Thomas watched from the corner of his eye as Prince George said something quietly to the tutor, who nodded and gestured for the other children to come closer. Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis joined their brother, looking up at Thomas with open curiosity. Prince George spoke to his younger siblings in a low voice, clearly explaining something about the guards and their role. Thomas could not hear the specific words, but he recognized the tone of instruction, one sibling teaching others about something he found meaningful. Princess Charlotte listened with serious attention, while young Prince Louis seemed more interested in Thomas's tall bearskin hat and shiny buttons. Then Prince George did something that surprised Thomas even after 3 years. The young prince turned to his siblings and demonstrated the proper way to stand at attention, his posture straightening, his chin lifting, his hands at his sides. Princess Charlotte immediately mimicked her brother's stance, understanding this was something important. Even little Prince Louis tried his best, his small body swaying slightly but making a genuine effort to stand still. Thomas felt his chest tighten with emotion. Here was a future king teaching his siblings, one of whom would herself likely play an important role in the monarchy's future, about respect and duty and service. And he was using Thomas, an ordinary guard, as the example. The moment felt weighted with significance that reached beyond the immediate present. The 3 children stood at attention for perhaps 30 seconds, which was an eternity for young Prince Louis, but a demonstration of real discipline from the older 2. Their tutors and protection officers watched with approval, understanding that this was more than a game. This was education in values that would shape how these young royals understood service and duty throughout their lives. When they relaxed their posture, Prince George took a step closer to Thomas's post. For a moment their eyes met, Thomas's forward gaze briefly intersecting with the young prince's direct look. In that instant of connection, Thomas saw recognition and gratitude. Prince George remembered their first encounter. He remembered what it had meant to him, and he wanted Thomas to know that it still mattered. Then Prince George brought his hand up in another salute, crisp and proper, holding it with the same respect he had shown 3 years earlier. But this time Princess Charlotte and Prince Louis followed their brother's lead, their small hands rising in their own salutes, each executed with as much precision as their ages allowed. Thomas felt something break open in his chest, a flood of emotion that he carefully contained behind his trained, neutral expression. 3 years ago, one young prince had acknowledged him. Now 3 royal children stood honoring his service, carrying forward the lesson their brother had learned and was now teaching them. This was legacy in action, values being passed down through example. The children held their salutes for a respectful moment, then lowered their hands together. Prince George nodded once to Thomas, a small gesture that communicated volumes, then gently guided his younger siblings away down the garden path. The tutors and protection officers followed, and the courtyard returned to its usual quiet. Thomas stood his post for the remainder of his shift, but his mind was full of reflections. He thought about that day 3 years ago when he had been planning to resign, feeling unappreciated and invisible. He thought about the wordless gesture from a 9-year-old boy that had changed everything. He thought about the letter, the drawings from school children, the renewed sense of purpose that had carried him through 3 more years of service. Most of all, he thought about what he had just witnessed. A young prince teaching his siblings about respect and duty, using an ordinary guard as his example. That lesson would ripple forward through their lives, shaping how they understood service and dedication. And someday, when Prince George became king, perhaps he would remember the guards who stood their posts with dignity, and perhaps that memory would influence how he led. When Thomas's shift ended and he marched away from his post, He knew with certainty that his time with the Queen's Guard was coming to a natural close, not because of frustration or disillusionment, but because he had given what he came to give. He had served with honor. He had been seen and acknowledged by people who mattered. He had inspired children, including royal children, to understand the value of duty and commitment. That evening, Thomas sat down at his desk and wrote his retirement letter. But this letter was different from the resignation he had planned 3 years earlier. This was not an angry departure or a frustrated exit. This was a grateful completion of service well rendered. He wrote about his 33 years with the Queen's Guard, about the honor of serving, about the meaning he had found in standing as a symbol of tradition and duty. He wrote about encounters with countless visitors, about inspiring children, about being part of something larger than himself. He mentioned, briefly and humbly, the meaningful encounter with Prince George that had reminded him why his service mattered. He set his retirement date for 6 months in the future, allowing proper time for transition and for finding his replacement. He would finish well, standing his posts with the same dignity he had maintained throughout his career, grateful for every moment rather than counting down days until freedom. Margaret read the letter over his shoulder and kissed the top of his head. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. "You're leaving because it's time, not because you're running away. That makes all the difference." Thomas submitted his letter the next morning. His commanding officer read it carefully, then looked up at him with understanding in his eyes. "Crawford, it's been an honor serving with you. You've embodied everything we hope to represent. The service will miss you, but I understand. 33 years is a long time to stand at attention." Over the following months, Thomas continued his duties while word spread of his impending retirement. Fellow guards sought him out for advice and stories. Younger guards asked him questions about maintaining discipline and finding meaning in the work. Thomas found himself becoming an informal mentor, passing on not just technical skills but the deeper understanding of what their service represented. On his final day of duty, Thomas stood at the same post where he had first encountered Prince George nearly 3.5 years earlier. The commanding officer had quietly arranged this as a tribute, understanding the significance of that location. Thomas wore his uniform with pride, every button polished, every detail perfect. This would be his last time standing guard, and he wanted to honor the moment. As the morning progressed toward the hour when his shift would end and his career with it, Thomas reflected on everything that had brought him to this point. He thought about the young man he had been when he joined, full of idealistic pride and uncomplicated certainty. He thought about the middle-aged man who had nearly walked away in bitterness and frustration. And he thought about the man he had become, someone who understood that meaning came not from external validation, but from internal commitment to something worthy. Just before his final shift ended, Thomas heard familiar voices one last time. He did not turn his head, but his heart recognized the sounds even before he saw the figures in his peripheral vision. Prince George, now truly on the cusp of adolescence, approached with his siblings and attendants. They stopped near his post, and Thomas understood that somehow, someone had let the young prince know this was his final day. Prince George stood before Thomas one last time, his bearing more mature now, but his expression carrying the same respect Thomas remembered from their first encounter. The young prince raised his hand in a final salute, holding it with perfect precision. His siblings joined him, the 3 royal children honoring Thomas's service in this last moment. This time, as Thomas's shift officially ended and his replacement had not yet arrived for the handover, something extraordinary happened. Thomas, freed from his duty for these brief moments between shifts, brought his own hand up and returned the salute. It was a breach of typical protocol, but it was also the right thing to do, the human thing to do, acknowledging the connection that had formed across the distance between a prince and a guard. The salute lasted only a moment, but it completed a circle that had begun 3.5 years earlier, with a wordless gesture that changed everything. Then Thomas lowered his hand, and Prince George lowered his, and they shared a brief smile of mutual understanding before the young prince and his siblings walked away for the last time. Thomas's replacement arrived moments later, and they executed the formal changeover for the final time. Thomas marched away from his post, removed his uniform for the last time, and walked out of the palace gates as a civilian, his career complete. But he did not walk away empty-handed. He carried with him the memory of a young boy's salute, a letter written in careful handwriting, Drawings from inspired children and, most importantly, the knowledge that his 33 years of service had mattered. He had stood his post with dignity. He had inspired future leaders. He had embodied values that would ripple forward through time in ways he would never fully know. That evening, sitting with Margaret in their quiet home, Thomas felt at peace. His career was over, but its meaning lived on in the children he had inspired, in the prince who would someday be king and who had learned something about service from an ordinary guard, who chose to stand with honor even when no one seemed to be watching. Prince George had been watching, and his wordless gesture had spoken volumes about the power of acknowledgement, the importance of seeing others, and the enduring value of duty performed with integrity. It was a lesson that would stay with both of them for the rest of their lives, a reminder that sometimes the smallest gestures carry the greatest meaning, and that true service is its own reward.